The overnight pharmacy window had a bell that never worked right, so people just knocked. And at 2 in the morning, the knock was always either kind or desperate, never in between. Mine was desperate. A father holding a fussy toddler, a torn prescription slip, and the particular panic of a person who'd been up for 19 hours straight. I'm Priya Anand, and I filled that prescription with hands that were shaking almost as much as his, because I'd been up 19 hours too, chasing an inventory discrepancy that my supervisor had all but told me I'd be blamed for. That's when Dr. Callum Reyes leaned against the counter, like he'd materialized out of the fluorescent hum, and said, "You didn't order that batch." I saw the invoice. It came in already short. I didn't ask how he knew. That was the thing about Callum. He worked one floor up in internal medicine, and somehow he always knew exactly the thing I needed someone to say, exactly when I needed to hear it. He'd shown up the week my father was hospitalized 2 states away, quietly covering a shift swap I hadn't even asked for. He'd shown up the day I got chewed out in the stairwell by a vendor rep, materializing at the top of the steps like he'd been waiting there the whole time. Though I told myself that was coincidence, because who waits in a stairwell? "Thank you," I said that night, meaning it for more than the invoice. "You always seem to be exactly where the fire is." He almost smiled. Callum smiled the way some men whisper. Rare, and only when he meant it. "Good instincts," he said, and left before I could ask what that meant. I want to tell this part honestly, because I think anyone who's worked retail pharmacy, or really any job where the customer's crisis becomes your emergency, will recognize the shape of what happened next. The discrepancy got worse. Someone had been skimming controlled substances from my window for months, small enough that it took an audit to notice, and I was the one who'd signed the log. My manager, a tired woman named Denise who'd stopped fighting for her staff around the same time she stopped believing in Christmas bonuses, told me corporate wanted someone's name on the incident report, and mine was cleanest to write down. I want to say I fought it. I filed everything I could, pulled every camera timestamp, and stayed 3 nights past midnight building a case that proved I hadn't touched that stock. Callum helped, though I never asked him to, pulling patient safety logs from his own department that happened to cross-reference the exact hours in question, appearing at HR meetings I hadn't told him about, standing in doorways with his arms crossed like a man guarding something he wasn't allowed to name. "Why do you care this much?" I asked him once, in the break room that smelled permanently of burnt coffee. "You barely know me." He looked at me for a long moment, the kind of look that made me feel both examined and safe, which shouldn't be possible at the same time. "I know enough," he said, and turned back to his chart. If you've ever had someone show up for you without explaining why, you know how maddening that is, how you start doing the math on it, wondering if it's kindness or guilt or something else entirely, and how the not knowing becomes its own quiet ache alongside the crisis you're actually living through. They cleared my name eventually, mostly on paper. Corporate called it a resolution, which is a word companies use when they want you gone without saying so. Denise cried when she told me they were still letting me go. "Budget cuts," she said, though the timing told a different story. My last shift was a Thursday. Nobody threw a party. I turned in my badge to a security guard who barely looked up, and I walked out past the elevator bank where I used to see Callum most mornings, and he wasn't there. I told myself that was fitting. Whatever he'd been doing, it clearly hadn't been about me specifically. Maybe he did that for everyone. Maybe I'd built a whole private mythology out of a man who was simply, professionally, decent. I was 3 weeks into a new job at a clinic across town, folding myself into a routine that didn't include watching a certain doorway, when a woman named Reyes came through my line for a refill. Reyes. I almost didn't say anything, but something made me ask. Any relation to a Callum Reyes? Internal medicine, over at Fairview? Her face did something complicated. "My son," she said. "He asked me not to say anything to you, but I don't see the harm now that you don't work there anymore." She lowered her voice like she was handing me something fragile. 6 years ago, my late husband was your patient. Not you. The pharmacy. The old location. Before you started, I think. There was an error. A bad one. Callum wasn't even in his residency yet. He watched his father get hurt by a system and swore that if he ever worked anywhere near a pharmacy again, he'd make sure nobody good got crushed by it the way his dad did, and nobody responsible got blamed for what wasn't their fault. He'd been watching that department for years, watching you, specifically, since you transferred in. He said you reminded him of the pharmacist who should have been protected the first time and wasn't. I stood there with a bottle of amlodipine in my hand, feeling something in my chest rearrange itself entirely. He hadn't been circling me out of guilt over something I'd done. He'd been circling a memory, an old wound, trying to make sure history didn't repeat itself on his watch. And I happened to be standing where the repeat would have landed. It wasn't about romance, not at first, not in the way I'd let myself half hope in the stairwells and break rooms. It was about a promise he'd made to a version of himself who'd been powerless once. I was the place he'd chosen to keep it. I don't know if that makes it more or less meaningful. I've turned that over more times than I probably should. Some nights I think it's the most selfless thing anyone's ever done for me, showing up for years without asking for a single thing back. Other nights I wonder if I'd have wanted to know sooner, if knowing would have changed how I looked at him in all those doorways, or whether not knowing was its own kind of gift, letting the kindness stand on its own before I could complicate it with a reason. He called me that weekend. Estelle must have told him. His voice was rougher than I remembered, like a man bracing for a door to close. "I should have told you," he said. "I told myself I was protecting your privacy, not mine. I'm not sure that was true." "You could have just said it," I told him. "I'm watching out for you because of something that happened to my father. People can hold complicated things, Callum. I didn't want you to think it was pity," he said, "or debt. I wanted it to just be decency, until it wasn't only that anymore, and then I really didn't know how to say it." We met for coffee 2 days later, at a shop with nothing medical about it at all. No fluorescent hum, no badge on either of our chests. It felt strange to look at him without a doorway between us. Strange and good, the way it feels to finally sit down after a shift you didn't know was still running. I still think about that flickering pharmacy window sometimes, the knock that never matched the broken bell. I think about how much of what carried me through the worst of it turned out to be a man keeping a promise to his father, one I didn't even know existed until I was already gone from the place where it mattered. I don't know if I'll ever fully decide whether it's romantic that he waited so long to tell me, or whether he should have trusted me with it from the very first doorway. Maybe both things are true. Maybe you'll land somewhere different than I did, and honestly, I'd like to hear where.